What did university originally mean? How the university idea was actually born? Why it was needed in the first place? Where the first universities appeared? How they evolved over time? When and how they became autonomous institutions? What titles like dean, rector, and professor originally meant? And why appointment and election systems developed the way they did? Did they just job schools or diploma factories? Or are we completely missing the point? The word university comes from the Latin word universitas, which means a collective body, a corporation. Specifically, it referred to the union of teachers and students. And here's something interesting. It does not originally mean universe or universal knowledge, even though we often think of it that way today. A university is not just a place that hands out a diploma at the end of 4 years. Historically, it's a place that protects knowledge, produces new knowledge, and transmits knowledge across generations. And it only becomes that kind of institution when it has a strong tradition, genuine autonomy, and a thriving intellectual ecosystem. In the earliest European phase, around the 11th century, what's absolutely fascinating is that the organization often began from student guilds. Students would band together, they would choose their instructors, they would decide how much to pay them, and they would even influence what subjects were taught. In other words, the structure could be surprisingly bottom-up, student-driven. This is very different from what we see today. Before universities, the medieval education ladder. But before the university model became formalized, there was already a major educational framework in place. This framework structured how people thought about learning itself. First, there was the trivium, the 3 core skills. Grammar, which was about language mastery, really understanding how language works. Rhetoric, which was about effective speaking, persuasion, the art of convincing others, and logic, which was about reasoning, thinking clearly, constructing arguments. These 3 subjects prepared a person for social and civic life. You learned to speak clearly, argue logically, and use language properly. These were the foundations of being an educated person. Then came the quadrivium, the 4 advanced disciplines: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Now this phase trained the mind in mathematical thinking, and here's something that surprises people. Even music was understood through mathematical ratios and proportions. It wasn't just art, it was mathematics made audible. This educational logic, this structure of the trivium and quadrivium goes all the way back to antiquity, to Greek and Roman thinkers, and then it becomes the backbone of medieval education throughout Europe. The first university, long before Western Europe. Now, if we go back about 700 years before the 11th century, before Bologna, before Paris, we arrive at a striking historical claim. The earliest university-like institution was actually founded in Constantinople in 425 CE. That's right, 425, in what is now Istanbul. The name of this institution essentially meant the place where everything is taught. It was designed primarily to train administrators and jurists for a large, complex empire. You needed educated people to run a vast bureaucracy, and this institution was meant to produce them. Its structure included many chairs devoted to different subjects: Latin grammar, because the administrative language of the empire was Latin; rhetoric, for public speech and persuasion, critical for anyone working in government or law; law itself, obviously essential for a legal empire; and philosophy. But here's what's important. It lacked a strong institutional place for natural sciences. It produced important scholars, absolutely, but its core function leaned heavily toward administration, law, and rhetoric, rather than scientific inquiry as a systematic institutional practice. And this institution, in different forms and with different levels of activity, lasted until 1453. Think about that. It survived for more than 1,000 years. That's longer than many modern universities have existed. So what happened in 1453? After the conquest of Constantinople, what remained of that institutional library and organizational structure was largely destroyed in the chaos of conquest and the looting that followed. Some manuscripts and scholars had already left earlier, especially in the decades leading up to the fall, carrying texts westward, particularly Greek manuscripts. These texts would later feed the intellectual revival happening in various parts of Europe, what we now call the Renaissance. So the end of this institution was not only a policy decision by the new rulers, it was also the result of physical upheaval and destruction, combined with the reality that a different educational tradition, one that was religiously centered, more focused on religious texts, and less open to critical inquiry, became dominant in the region. The European university, how it actually begins. Now let's shift to Western Europe. The first famous example of what we would recognize as a university is Bologna, with educational activity recorded from 1088. Later, it becomes a formal public institution when an imperial authority grants it official teaching privileges and the state takes over paying salaries. This is a key moment. The state steps in and professionalizes the structure. Another absolutely key case is Paris, which begins in the mid-1100s and becomes especially influential across Europe. Paris is deeply tied to religious authority. The Catholic Church monitors the content of what's being taught, but the institution also gains power not only through knowledge, but through social and economic leverage. A city benefits economically from having students. When students go on strike or threaten to leave the city, the local economy feels it immediately, so universities had real bargaining power. In that period, universities could have what they called student nations. These were groups organized by students' geographic origin or language. Universities had the ability to suspend teaching as a form of leverage against city authorities, or even the church. And there was constant tension between university leadership, the church, and sometimes the crown. It was a complicated power dynamic. Rectors, deans, and professors, what the titles originally meant. Now, let's talk about these titles we hear all the time: rector, dean, and professor. These were not just bureaucratic positions or administrative titles. Their meaning comes directly from teaching authority and scholarly hierarchy. Here's a rough ladder of how it worked. You would begin as an assistant to a master, basically an apprentice. Then you would earn the formal right to teach, and to teach was an actual privilege, something you had to be granted. Titles evolved around the ability to instruct students and eventually to lead a chair, meaning a specific area of teaching. So these weren't just jobs, they were recognized positions of intellectual authority. Faculties, upper versus lower. A medieval university typically had a hierarchy of faculties. There were what they called upper faculties: theology, law, and medicine. All three of these were explicitly connected to the religious worldview and to church authority. Theology is obvious, but even law and medicine were understood through a Christian framework. Then there was the lower faculty: arts, philosophy, and what we'd call natural knowledge. This is where students could eventually become teaching masters themselves. But notice the hierarchy. The lower faculty was subordinate. This structure also shows you why theological control remained so powerful for so many centuries. The church's intellectual authority was baked into the system. Oxford and the rise of autonomous tradition.
Let's talk about Oxford. Oxford's early teaching activity appears by the late 11th century, but its rapid growth is actually tied to political events. There were restrictions and conflicts that pushed students and teachers away from Paris, and many of them ended up in England. Over time, the English collegiate system develops in a unique way. Colleges begin as residential communities, almost like dormitories, but with intense tradition, ritual, and a powerful sense of communal identity in life. And here's the key point I want to emphasize. A true university is not built overnight. You can't just construct buildings and hire some teachers and call it a university. It becomes a university through traditions and standards that are formed over centuries, shared understanding of what is acceptable scholarship, what is not, what the institution protects, what it refuses to tolerate. That accumulation of tradition is what gives a university its identity and its strength. The long shadow of religious control. Now, for hundreds of years, we're talking centuries, universities remain under religious supervision and control. Certain ideas are completely forbidden. You start seeing entire lists of prohibited propositions appear. These are ideas you're not allowed to teach. People can be and were punished for teaching things that violated church orthodoxy, sometimes severely punished. This is why academic freedom, the idea that scholars should be free to pursue truth wherever it leads, is not something that just appears suddenly one day. It's not a natural state. It is earned through long struggle, through conflict, through gradual institutional transformation, often through great personal risk to the people involved. The break, translation, reform, and public access to knowledge. A major shift occurs when religious texts, the Bible primarily, become accessible in vernacular languages, in the languages people actually spoke. For centuries, these texts were only in Latin, which meant only educated clergy could read them. When ordinary people can suddenly read these foundational texts for themselves, the clerical monopoly on knowledge and interpretation weakens dramatically. And that changes society, it changes education, and it changes institutional authority in fundamental ways. But even after this breakthrough, many universities become conservative strongholds again. Institutions can ossify. They can become rigid, resistant to new ideas. When that happens, societies sometimes have to create parallel institutions to bypass university rigidity entirely. So, what do reformers do when universities become too conservative? In one major model, instead of trying to found a new university, which would require getting permission from religious authorities, a state creates a structure of public lectures without diplomas, no exams, no degrees, just open access to knowledge. The strongest minds are invited to teach freely, and anyone can attend. Knowledge for its own sake. In another model, scientific academies form entirely outside the university system. These are communities of researchers, often supported by the state or by wealthy patrons, focused primarily on research rather than formal teaching. These academies later become elite clubs, where membership becomes a great honor, especially once universities themselves eventually transform into research institutions. But initially, they existed because universities weren't doing the job. The modern turning point, the birth of the research university. Now we come to the modern university as we understand it today, the idea that research and teaching should happen together in the same institution. This emerges mainly from a 19th century reform vision, particularly in German-speaking Europe. The core ideas were radical at the time. Professors should not merely read books aloud to students, which is basically what they'd been doing. They should produce new knowledge through original research. And students should learn not only what is known, but how knowledge is actually made, the methods, the process of discovery. This research university model spreads rapidly across the world, especially after the major political upheavals and mass migrations of scholars in the 20th century. World wars, fascism, revolutions. Scholars flee, they bring these ideas with them, and this model becomes the backbone of modern science funding systems and national research ecosystems everywhere. Outside Europe, why did science didn't institutionalize the same way? Now, an important question. Why did this happen in Europe and not elsewhere? Let's look at a few major cases. Japan. For a long period, Japan remains relatively closed to the outside world and highly militarized. Modernization accelerates dramatically in the 19th century, particularly after the Meiji Restoration, And how do they do it? By sending large numbers of students to the West, to Europe and America, to learn. The Japanese economic miracle is built substantially on importing and then institutionalizing Western scientific and university systems. China had an extremely sophisticated bureaucracy and exam system for selecting state officials. The civil service exams were incredibly demanding, but they focused heavily on classical texts, on Confucian philosophy, on moral principles, not on institutional science as we understand it. Engineering knowledge existed where it was needed, for building canals, infrastructure, military technology. But science didn't become a university-based research tradition until the 20th century, and even then it suffered major disruptions through political movements that were explicitly hostile to intellectual life, particularly during the Communist Revolution. Russia modernizes rapidly through state-driven reforms, especially under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. They very deliberately import Western institutional models, including the university model, often bringing in foreign scholars to establish them. Final thoughts. So let me bring this all together. The university is largely a European institution, and its transformation into what I'm calling a science-producing machine, an engine of new knowledge, is extremely recent in historical terms. We're talking the last 150 to 200 years. Universities did not appear fully formed. They were born under religious shadow and control. They struggled for autonomy over centuries. They built traditions slowly through conflict and persistence, and they only became the modern research university through deliberate, conscious reform by people who understood what was at stake. Nothing about this was easy. Nothing about this was quick. Institutions that last, institutions that matter, are built through long struggle, through consistency, through the accumulation of tradition and shared values. And that is exactly why the university crisis we're seeing today is not a simple problem of buildings or student numbers or budget allocations. It's a problem of mission, it's a problem of autonomy, it's a problem of culture, and it's a problem that takes time to solve. You can't fix it overnight. If we want real universities, we have to understand what a university actually is. It's not a diploma factory. It's not a job training center. It's a living institution whose purpose is to produce knowledge, to protect knowledge, and to transmit knowledge to the next generation. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, feel free to share, like, and subscribe.